Howdy, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Fort Worth Property Management Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in to episode 4. This is a solid one. I just finished editing the full episode, and in this episode, there are some good golden nuggets in there. The topic of today is lease renewals, how to raise rents, when to do them, how to do them, and then I even give you a few email examples that you can use to increase the likelihood that your tenant accepts the lease renewal at that higher rental rate. And so stick around to the end of the episode. We're super excited for you to hear it. Let's jump right in. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Fort Worth Property Management Podcast. I am your host, Mason Arispe. I am the Operations and Business Development Manager here at First Choice Property Management in Fort Worth, Texas. Thank you so much for tuning in to episode 4. Can you believe it's already been 4 episodes? Crazy, right? Super excited to have you back this week. Today, we're going to jump into a topic that every landlord wrestles with at some point. When is the right time to raise rent, and how do you do it fairly without losing a good tenant? Raising rents, a slightly controversial topic, but it's going to be great. I'm looking forward to today's episode. Look, nobody loves raising rents. Landlords, you don't want to push out or lose out on great tenants. Tenants don't want unexpected increases. When they move into a property, they're hoping their rental price never changes, but unfortunately, that's not always the case. And as a property management company, we are constantly balancing fairness between both parties, the owner and the tenant. We have to deal with balancing the fairness for tenants. We have to balance the reality of rising costs, market changes, but also maintaining the property in the right way. And so we're always walking that line of fairness. But here's the truth. Raising rent isn't about squeezing tenants for every last penny. It's about keeping your investment healthy. So today I'm going to walk you through when, why, and how to increase when that time comes around the smart way. And by the end of this episode, you'll know exactly how to approach your next renewal with confidence and hopefully raise rents and keep a good tenant. And today we're going to introduce a new segment called Behind Closed Doors. This is going to be a quick 1 to 2 minute update on First Choice Property Management, inside scoop, kind of the inside look at our operations, what we do. Now, before we get into the main topic of today, we're going to introduce a brand new segment to the podcast, and it's going to be a part of every podcast moving forward. It's called Behind Closed Doors. This is going to be where I give you an inside look at what's happening here at First Choice Property Management, the current state of the Fort Worth rental market, and everything going on behind the scenes here at First Choice that will provide our homeowners a better property management experience overall. So, First Choice Property Management, we currently manage 520 rental properties in the greater Fort Worth area. The greater Fort Worth area includes the city of Fort Worth, and then also suburbs like Hazlet, Aledo, Burleson, North Richland Hills, Arlington, and Keller. I would say it's about a 35-minute radius around our office that's located in North Fort Worth. We manage 520 properties. That is split between 3 property managers, all of which who have a whole staff underneath them to help manage these properties. The property manager's main tasks and main focus is the owners, the properties, and the tenants. That's what we want them dealing with, and we do our best to remove anything that may bog them down through the day so that they can be directly hand-on with your properties and anything going on at them. The average rental rate in Fort Worth for a 3-bedroom rental is currently $2,112. Average is still holding extremely strong because over the last month or two, we have seen rental prices start to decrease as we get closer to the winter months, which traditionally is the slower part of the year for real estate. We currently have 30 properties on the market for rent right now. This is about 6% of our portfolio, which is actually higher than normal. It's typically about 3 to 4%, which equates to about 15 to 16 properties on the market. This was the case during summertime when we were busy and renting properties very frequently. Now that we've gotten to the slow part of the year, our vacancy has increased up to about 6% of our properties. So right now we're working on a few different things to try and get these houses occupied. During slow parts of the year like this, we do suggest price decreases, move-in specials. For example, $500 off the first month's rent for a tenant who moves in by December 1st. Something along those lines. Once we get to this point of the year, we do start introducing different methods to help your property stand out opposed to all those others in the neighborhood. Because as you can tell, even from the properties that we have on the market in Fort Worth, rental inventory is increasing dramatically. We've had the most rental properties on the market than we've had over the last 5 years. And so those of you who have been experiencing lower rental prices, that may be why. Once inventory increases, the demand for the property decreases, resulting in lower rents to try and find those tenants. And so we will introduce a few different things to try and get your property to stand out. Things like suggesting a price decrease to be more aggressive, suggesting professional photos to be taken of the property, or even the one that works best is a move-in special. For example, $500 off of the first month's rental payment for a tenant that moves in before December 1st. All of these are methods that you can use to get your property occupied during these winter months if you don't want to have to dramatically lower by hundreds of dollars. Now, we are still renting properties. We had our weekly meeting this morning, and this week we actually had an uptick in applications. We had 11 applications come in last week alone, which is very odd for our mid-November cycle. But of course, we're extremely thankful that we're getting those applications. That means we are finally getting the rental prices into the range that they need to be at. And then last thing, we're working on a few new projects here at First Choice to help improve our owners' property management experience. One, we're redoing our website, and so we will be launching a modernized structure of our website towards the end of this month. This will be new and updated, but still deliver the same value and information on our services as before. We're also launching a social media campaign, and so we're going to be dropping a lot more content on places like Facebook, LinkedIn, TikTok, just a bunch of different places to get our exposure out there. And then last, we're currently working on this year's round of winter updates for tenants, kind of blasting out emails reminding tenants to put the covers on the faucets outside, to open the cabinets, strip the faucets, things like that. We're getting all of those slated out for this winter season to hopefully avoid any type of pipes freezing, pipes bursting, stuff like that. We've really just ramped that up over the past few years since Snowmageddon in 2021. And so that's what we got going on over the last few weeks here at First Choice Property Management. But enough about us. Let's get into today's main topic. That is going to be raising rents, the right time to do it and the right way to do it. So let's set the stage. About 9 months ago, you rented your property. The tenants have been living there, and you know in 3 months their lease is going to expire because you signed a year lease. When this time rolls around, you have 3 options. Option 1, you don't renew to the tenants. Maybe they've been a bad renter, they've paid late a handful of times, they violated a lease a few times but you overlooked it, or maybe they're just not taking care of the property. And so option number 1 is you don't renew to them. You get them out after the lease is up, and then you try and re-rent it to a new renter. Option 2, they have been a good renter enough to want you to renew their lease for another year, and you don't raise the rental payment. This keeps the tenant happy, keeps them occupied in the property for hopefully another year, and there's no confrontation. There's no friction during the lease renewal. You just keep that current lease going for another year at the same rental rate. And then option 3, you do renew to them for another year, but you raise rents. This is the most favorable one, but also the most difficult. So they've been a good tenant, they're taking care of the property, but your costs have gone up. And so you want to raise their rental payment by however much amount, right? And so today we're going to talk through each of these 3 scenarios so that you know exactly what to look out for when deciding on whether or not to raise rent or even renew to the tenant in general. So first, we're going to talk about option 2 and option 3. They're a good tenant. You want them to stay in the house for another year. You're just not sure if you should raise rents or keep them the same. So we're going to start there, and then a little bit later, we'll get into when not to renew and when not to raise rents, okay? So ideally, you've walked the property. The condition looks good. They've paid rent on the first every month. Everything is going smooth. And so the first step in deciding whether to raise rents or not is understanding your market rent. A lot of times a self-managing landlord won't know what their market rate is because they'll typically rent it to a friend of a friend, somebody who was recommended to them from a coworker, or they'll just list it on Zillow at a random number and not know what their market rate is. And so over the years, if you haven't kept up with your market rate, you could suddenly get pretty behind. When we bring on landlords with the current tenant in place, we see that sometimes they're $200 to $300 low on their market rate. It's great because the house is occupied, but if you're $200 below market rent, that's $2,400 a year. That's an extra mortgage payment, right? And that's a lot of money. That can add up over time. And so, of course, the number one thing is to keep the house occupied with a good renter, but you also want to maximize your return on this investment. So when that gap from what your house is rented at to your market rate gets too big, that's when landlords potentially lose out on thousands. So you want to keep it as close to market rate as you can. So how do you determine that? How do you determine your market rate or your market rent? The first way is to run local comps. You're going to look at homes in about a half mile to 3/4 of a mile radius. If you live in an HOA or if you live in a subdivision with a similar builder, look in that subdivision and see what other houses that are the similar size, similar age, and similar condition as yours. Look at the ones that are currently listed for rent and look at the price that they're listed at. This is a slight indication of what you can list your property at. This is not a for sure rental price because if they're active on the market, they have not found a tenant yet, so they haven't been successful. But you want to start with looking at active listings because that's your competition. That's what you would be relisting for if the tenant moved out and you had to put the property back on the market. And of course, active houses are a good initial indication of what people are trying to get in the area. But you absolutely want to compare it to successfully rented properties in the last 90 days. You're going to look at the previous 3 months and you're going to look for what houses have successfully rented for. So if you have a property that's 1,500 square feet, a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, and it was just completely remodeled, you're going to look in your subdivisions for other 1,500 square feet homes, 3-bedroom, 2-bath that have been recently updated. And you're going to look what they successfully rented for. That's going to give you your best indication of what market rent is. So landlords, you can contact your local property management company. You can contact a real estate agent and they will provide you with comps. Or here are a few free tools for you. I'll give you a second to grab a pen and paper because I know you're going to want to write this down. A few places online that you can run comps yourself would be Zillow.com, Rentometer. It's spelled rentometer.com, Rentometer, PropStream. And then you can head over to fortworthpropertymanagement.com, enter your home and get a free rental analysis. And so those are 4 great platforms to use that you can get rental comps for your home and determine your market rate. You can also contact your local real estate agent or property management company. Once you determine your market rent, you're probably going to get a range. You're probably going to get a range for your market rent. And the next thing you want to look for is the demand. How quick are those houses renting? If your property's market rent is $2,000, but it's taken those houses 3 months to rent, I would consider your market rent maybe $100 less at $1,900, just because it took so long for those houses to rent. But vice versa, if it says your market rent is $2,000, but 2 of the houses rented in 7 days, that's a strong market. That means there's high demand in your neighborhood. You can be slightly more aggressive and go a little bit higher. And so you want to determine kind of the demand trends in your neighborhood for that time being to determine how much you want to raise rents if you do at all. And so what you want to do, once you have your fair market rent, you want to compare that to what your house is currently rented at. We call that a delta gap. The gap in between what your tenant's paying and what your market rate is. You want to do your best to determine if that gap is small or if it's big. If the gap is small, great. That means they're paying a fair market value. Either don't raise rents or only increase by about 2 to 3% just to cover your increasing holding costs. But if they're at fair market value and they're a good renter, I would do my best to keep that renter occupying the house so you don't have to worry about vacancy this time around. Now, if the gap is huge and you have a delta gap of about $300 or more, then it's definitely time to raise rents. I would raise rents about 5 to 6% this first go around, but have a multi-year plan to continue to increase so that you can get it to the market rate. Of course, if they're a good tenant, you definitely don't want to lose out on them. However, the idea here is that if you have a $300 delta gap, hypothetically, you could move the tenant out if they choose not to renew. You can relist it $300 higher and find a tenant at that higher price very easily. that's when you want to increase by that amount. Again, as the landlord, you need to find the balance of fairness for both parties. You still need to increase rent so that you can get increased income on your end, but also not so much that there's a huge shocking jump to the tenant. If they're paying $2,000 and you want to raise rents to $2,400, that's a big jump. That's a 20% increase. I know it only sounds like a couple $100, but that's a 20% increase of your rental payment. And so, if you have a huge gap, plan it out over the next 2 or 3 years, increase rents 5 to 6% every year, and catch back up with the market. But you have to balance that line to where you keep the tenant, but you still also increase your rental income. And so start there with understanding your market rent, the demand in your area, and then compare it to what the tenant's currently paying right now. So you figured out your market rate compared to what the tenant's paying. You've made your decision that you want to raise rents. There's one thing you got to keep in mind. That's timing is everything. You have the right market rate, but if you present it the wrong time, you're going to get pushback. So we're going to talk about this a few different ways. The first thing is in determining market rent, only use comps for the last 90 days. That's the last 3 months. However, you don't want to run these comps until 30 to 60 days before the lease ends. If you run comps too early, you're going to have an outdated market rate. And if you do it too late, you might miss out on your window to actually increase rents and the lease will just automatically renew. And so you want to run comps 30 to 60 days before the lease is up. That way at the 30-day mark, you can offer the tenant renewal at an increased rental payment. Okay? And the other side of the coin of that, and it usually goes without saying, but of course I'm going to say it, only raise the rents at renewal, never mid-lease. One, you signed a contract for 12 months, so you're locked in for that rental payment for the duration of those 12 months. But if you try to raise rent 6 months in, you tell them, hey, we rented your property too low, we're going to increase the rent by $300, they can say no, and then they still have a right to the property because you signed a contract for 12 months. But in addition to that, now they know at the end of their lease, they're either going to have to move again, which is a headache, or they're going to have to pay $300 more a month. So now they're going to be a little bit salty. They're going to be putting in work orders to fix the fan that's wobbly, or to go pull the weeds in the backyard, or, fix little things here and there. They're going to be nitpicky with the property. And even though you may not have to complete all of it, it will still be a headache for those next 6 months. So only raise rents at renewal. Never do it mid-lease. So to recap these last two sections, you want to determine your market rate, compare it to your rental price, look for that delta gap, determine if it is small or large. If it is large enough and you want to raise rents, then only begin running comps towards the end of their lease. You should determine how much you're going to increase by and make sure that you walk the line of fairness to where, one, you keep the tenant, but two, you also increase your income. And then timing is everything. Run comps towards the end of their lease, 30 to 60 days out, and then only raise rents at renewal. Never earlier, never mid-lease. So now that we figured out how to determine the market rates, how much to increase by, and then the timing that we're going to do it, now we're going to jump into the difficult part. How do you communicate over to the renter that you're increasing their rent? This is always the tough part. Nobody likes confrontation and nobody likes upsetting somebody else. And so communication is really where you win or lose the renewal. I mean, how you communicate it over to a tenant will impact their response, will impact whether you get the deal done or not. So the first thing, give appropriate notice. You need to do this at the very minimum 30 days before their lease ends. 45 days is a little bit more of a common courtesy. It is a good common practice that is used by landlords across Texas. So what you want to do whenever you approach this subject is you want to keep the tone professional, but you also want to prove the value that you're bringing. So first, I would communicate with them via text or email. That way you have everything documented during this conversation. If the tenant's preferred method is phone call, of course you can communicate via phone call if you'd like, but then recap over text or email so that you have it written down. What I would do is, one, I would fill out, in Texas, we call it an extension of a residential lease. And so it's basically a lease renewal form notifying the tenant that we would like to offer you renewal for another year. Now your lease is going to end 1 year from now. And then there's a second blank. So it says your lease is going to extend to this date and your new rental price is going to be X. and that's where you enter the new rental payment. And so that is how you officially notify them that you're raising their rent, and they do have to sign that document. So you're going to have to give them that at some point to keep this conversation professional. Is I would fill that form out, I would send it to them in an email, and here's the email that I would send to our tenants. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Tenant. We are super excited to announce that you've almost been living in our property for 1 full year now. Your lease expires on X date, and we're super excited to offer you a lease renewal for another year. We would like to renew your lease to Y date. So you're going to start the body of your paragraph super exciting, super happy, super thankful for them. Start it off energetic, professional, have ChatGPT write you this if you need to. And then after that, after you do the terms of what you want to renew at, underneath that you tab down, and underneath that you're going to give the reasons that you're raising the rent. You have to have some type of value driven, you have to have some type of data or some type of reason to give the tenants to raise their rents. So you can use things like market conditions, property improvements, an increased mortgage price, like your taxes or insurance is increased or something like that. And so you want to use these examples in the bottom half of your email. And this is how you want to frame it. Unfortunately, Tarrant County has increased our property taxes over the last year, and our mortgage has increased by $200. Therefore, the new rental price that we are offering you renewal is $100 higher than the last one. We are going to cover half of the property taxes and then build the other half of that increase into the rental price. We really appreciate your understanding at this, and we genuinely look forward to another year with you in the property. Man, that was off the dome. That was great. There's no ChatGPT up or anything like that. That was off the dome. That was nice. But that's a good way to phrase your email. There's also a few other examples that you can use, like home improvements. Unfortunately, since we had that huge leak in the primary bathroom and we completely redid it, we're going to have to recoup those costs at some point. So we're raising the rent by $50 or $100 a month, and we look forward to having you in the property for another year. Another example, fortunately, we looked at the market this year. The market has increased significantly. We're about $300 below market rate, and so you're getting a really great deal right now. Of course, we do not want to kick you out of the house by any means. Instead of bumping you up $300 a month, we're just going to do $100 this time around because we genuinely enjoy having you in the property as a tenant. Boom. I'm giving you gold here, people. This is great. Write this down. Put this in ChatGPT. Say, hey, talk like Mason at First Choice Property Management because this dude's killing it. But that is how you soften the blow whenever you break the news to the tenant. Here's an example of what you don't want to do. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Tenant. Your rent is increasing by $300 starting next month. Please sign this piece of paper. You don't want to do that. The way that you get the deal done is that you provide the reasoning for why the rent is increasing. If you have a good, solid reason for why rent is increasing, the tenant will relate to it, they will understand it, and then they're more susceptible to sign that lease renewal. If you give no reason behind your rent increase, you are now an evil landlord who just wants to increase rent all the time. Nobody wants to be that, so don't be that landlord. Provide some reason behind why you're raising rent, and the tenant will relate to it. Man, I gave you some gold right there. I gave you a few solid emails to use whenever you're renewing to your tenant. So if you need some more knowledge right off the dome like that, leave a comment, shoot me a message, and I'll help you type up an email to renew to your tenants. Of course, all of us here at First Choice, we are licensed. We have our real estate license, so we can run comps for you at any time. Shoot us a message. We're happy to run comps for you and help determine a market rate. All right, so now that we've typed up the email, we have our form all filled out, and we're sending it to the tenant. One thing we have to realize is that almost everything in real estate is a negotiation. Hopefully, all they'll message back is, okay, sounds good, we'll renew, tell us where to sign, and they'll sign it. It doesn't always work out that way. Majority of them don't work out that way. So the majority of the time, it's a negotiation. Sometimes they'll come back with a different price that they'd be comfortable with. They'll say, can we actually only increase by 50 instead of 100? Or they'll do all these things, and this is going to be up to you as the landlord to determine how much leverage you have and how much flexibility that you have. And so the number one thing that influences this decision whenever they choose to negotiate is how great of a tenant they are. If they are a tier 1 top of the line tenant. They pay rent. They pay rent like clockwork on the first. They've only submitted one work order in the past 3 years. The condition of the property is immaculate. It's actually better than when they moved in somehow. If they're just a phenomenal tenant, I'm telling you to have a lot more flexibility, because keeping a great tenant is worth more than raising rents. I'll show you why in a second. However, if the tenant is not as great, if they've been late on a few payments, but you've overlooked that, if maybe they got a new cat and they didn't tell you about it, but you saw it during your inspection of the house, different things that you might have looked over throughout the lease every month, right? Figure out where that tenant lies, and the less great the tenant is, the less flexibility I would have on that rental price increase, okay? So here are some creative things that you can do for those great tenants, for the really good ones. If you increased your rent at 6% and they're not too happy with it, suggest renewing for a longer lease, 18 to 24 months, and will only raise the rent by 2 or 3%. That way they get a lower rental price, and then explain to them, we're not going to raise rents as much, and then you're going to have a longer lease, so that's less opportunities for us to raise rents again. And so, of course, it looks favorable in their mind. However, you as the landlord, you got a solid rental payment for the next 18 to 24 months. You know what I mean? And so it's a win-win for everybody. Like I said, it's about walking that fine line of balance. And then for those great tenants, you can also suggest flexible upgrades, maybe things that don't cost you a bunch to do, but will still tell the tenant that we really value you as a renter. So upgrades like that are going to be low cost, but that add some value to the tenant. Things like maybe ceiling fan upgrades in the bedroom instead of like a pendant light, adding smart thermostats, or maybe even smart lighting if you wanted to. Those are really cool things that tenants like. Offering to do a home cleaning or carpet cleanings, doing lawn care, pest control for them a few times throughout the year. These are all things that you can do to show the tenant that you value them, that will help justify either a rental price increase or a longer lease over time. And all of that is stuff that you can do to just say, we really value you as a renter. It goes a lot further than you think. All right, now let's pivot towards the opposite side of the coin, when not to raise rent. There are a few times when you should not do it at all, okay? So let's go through a few different scenarios of when not to raise rents. Right off the bat, number one, when not to raise rent is when you're not renewing to them. We've had landlords in the past who say, this is an awful tenant, they're destroying the place, but if they pay $500 a month more, I'll keep them. No, if they're a bad tenant, if they're not paying on time, if they're destroying the house, get them out. Do not raise rents, get them out of the property, and look for a new tenant at market rate. That'll save you a bunch of headache and a bunch of money. So don't raise rents on a tenant that you don't want living in a house for another year. More realistically, there are a few times where you have a good renter you want to renew to, but it's the wrong time to raise rents. The first instance is don't raise rents just because a property needs a repair. Repair on the house is normal maintenance. That comes along with owning real estate. You need to know that. And so if they call you and say, my AC went out, it's the middle of July and I need this AC fixed, don't say, okay, I'll do that, but we're going to raise your rents at the end of this year. That is absolutely not how it works. And so don't raise rents then. And then, of course, if you complete the repair and your lease renewal is coming up, I also wouldn't raise the rents after a big headache, like if the tenant had to go a week or two without AC. Now, if it happens in the middle of a lease and you do some incredible upgrade, for example, if there's a leak under the shower and you have to gut the whole thing, install super nice tile, you go above and beyond for the tenant, at lease renewal, months later, I would consider it then to recoup some money, right? That's when I would do it, but not just because they called you and submitted a work order. The second time I would not raise rents is when the market is soft. Whenever it is not a strong rental market, some key signs that you want to look for is that there's a lot of other houses on the market in your neighborhood. And if those houses are all lower in rental price than what you currently have, if your market rate is either identical or lower to what the tenant is currently paying, that means over the last year, your rental price has not increased. So the market isn't booming at the time. And then times like November and December, that is the slowest time of the year. Nobody wants to move during that time of year. However, since it's slow for real estate, that means the renter has all the leverage. If they wanted to go down the street and rent another house in the middle of winter, they could. There's plenty of inventory for it. So when the market is soft, I would not suggest raising rents by a huge amount. And then I'm a little bit more soft in this game than others, but I personally would not raise rents after a tenant goes through a major life event. If they have a death of a close family member, death of a pet, there's a few different instances where you do want to have some grace with the tenants. There will be landlords out there. There will be property management companies who tell you it just sucks to suck. You need to raise rents. But I personally think that, of course, if it's a good renter, good, solid renter, if they didn't miss any of their rental payments during this hardship, I personally would have some grace on that tenant and not raise rents. If they still prioritized my rental payment during a time of hardship, they're a good renter in my eyes, and I would do my best to keep them. Of course, it's a good renter, so they're taking care of the house, they're paying rent, stuff like that. It's got to be in the right instance, but I would have some grace with the tenant if they just recently went through some type of hardship in their life. And so those are a few different areas where I personally would not raise rents. I would work towards either keeping the tenant or, in the case that they're a bad renter, getting them out and finding somebody new. Okay, so we've gone through a lot there. Let's kind of recap, bring it all together to start. Raising rent is a methodical, thought out, and strategic process. It has to be done correctly, or you're not going to win the deal. You as the landlord, you need to combine market awareness, good timing, and some dang good communication to protect your investment and keep it at a great return, right? Those are the goals. Protect your investment with a good, solid renter, but also get a good return on that investment. So know your market, determine your market rate, determine the best time to renew, do it at the appropriate time, and then determine how good of a tenant you have. Take into account the tenant that you have in place, because ultimately you want to do your best to keep those great tenants as long-term as you can. Like I mentioned, if you want help determining the right market rent for your property, head over to our website at fortworthpropertymanagement.com. We have a free rental analysis generator for you. It'll give you a quick market rent in about 30 seconds. All you have to put in is your property, your email address, and it'll send it right over to your email. You can also reach out to me directly. You can send me a message. Leave a comment on this podcast on whatever platform that you see it on, and I'd be happy to run a rental analysis for you as well. All of us here at First Choice, we are here to provide as much help over to y'all as we can. And so reach out to any of us here at First Choice Property Management. We're happy to assist with any of this, especially writing up those emails. You hear that? Right off the top of the head, it wrote out those emails for you to send over to your tenant. This was a great episode. Thank you so much for tuning in again. This is episode 4 of the Fort Worth Property Management Podcast. When is the right time to raise rents and how to do it fairly? Make sure you follow the podcast. This next few podcasts that we got lined up are great. We are going to have another guest star that's going to be coming on, a colleague of mine who I just saw during my trip to Nashville. So one of the podcasts coming up in the next month or so is going to be the 10 best questions to ask when searching for a property manager. So for those of you who have been on the line and determining if you should even hire a property management company or not, we're going to give you, in our opinion, the 10 best questions that you can ask to get to know your property manager and to get to try and trust them. It's going to be a great, and that is a wrap for episode 4 of the Fort Worth Property Management Podcast. I am your host, Mason Arispe, here at First Choice Property Management. If you found some value in today's conversation, make sure you follow the show, leave a comment, leave a 5-star review, and then more importantly, share it with somebody that you know who's a landlord or an investor. Share it with somebody who you think could get some value out of this. For more resources on being a good landlord or property management, head over to fortworthpropertymanagement.com, where we help you protect your investment and make owning your rental property a little bit easier. Thank you so much for listening. We appreciate each and every one of you. We will see you in a couple weeks. Have a good rest of your day.